Good afternoon. I decided to do this podcast because I wanted to get something off my chest about COVID-19 and the whole pandemic and all of that. If you followed this podcast, or you know me personally, you know I'm a science fiction fan. And I'm not a really big doomsday person or anything like that. But I do recognize that science doesn't have the answer to everything. That science can sometimes be wrong, and science can sometimes be tragically wrong. I am worried about our response to COVID-19. I am worried about the long-term implications of our response. What it means for us as a society, and what it means for us as a civilization worldwide. As of right now, as I'm looking at looking up the statistics, and give me a moment while I do that, I want to make sure I have them right. It is the 26th of August, 2020. As of this date, 5,781,834 people have been infected with the coronavirus. Of that, 178,578 have died. Those are very big numbers, to say the least. Now, some of you will say, well, the trend is falling, and right now it is falling. Thank goodness. Both deaths and new cases are falling right now. But in my home state, cases are rising for right now. As I'm looking at the statistic board on an app called Smart News, 11 states are rising, including North Carolina. 18 are falling and 21 are flat. Now, there's good news and bad news everywhere. As we've seen, nothing stays the same. My biggest fear is what happens this wintertime, when flu season hits, when people's immune systems go down, when you have a holiday season, and when you have stores that decide to have big sales, despite the fact that most of the major stores are going to be closed on Thanksgiving. And we will not see Black Friday sales anymore, at least for this year, and maybe for the next couple of years, until we're certain that this thing is gone. Or at least it's tamed enough to where it's basically like the flu nowadays. And even then, given the way that retail is these days, we may never see it again because people are going to pace their spending more and spend more online. And that means, why have a big one-day sale with a lot of deals if people are going to buy it beforehand anyway? And maybe one of these days I'll talk about those retail trends one of these days, given the fact that I'm a veteran of retail. All these numbers right now on the surface look good. And I hope they stay that way. Doesn't excuse the fact that the current administration has botched this. Doesn't excuse the fact that compared to other countries, our response has been horrible and incompetent. It's that simple. My fear is that we will let our guard down. That once numbers get to a seemingly acceptable level, we'll open things back up again. will go without mask and social distancing and all of this and go back to the way it was. And we'll be right back into the thick of it again next spring. The truth is, as much as I want to hope for the best, is that I personally feel that we've only scratched the surface of this. History shows us that the first wave isn't necessarily the deadliest. The most recent global pandemic was 100 years ago. It was the Spanish influenza. As I look up some numbers on that, if you'll give me a moment. This comes from the CDC. Well, I didn't have the numbers I want, so let me find Wikipedia. There we go. Okay. It lasted from February 1918 to April of 1920. It infected 500 million people worldwide, about a third of the world's population at the time, in 4 successive waves. The death toll is estimated to have been somewhere between 17 and 50 million people, making it one of the deadliest pandemics in human history. That comes straight from Wikipedia. This was a different time, of course, a century ago. Record keeping wasn't as vigorous as it is now. Information is a lot more available today. But you look at the numbers of confirmed cases. 1 to 100 so far, or at least globally. It is now, let's see, it's 23 million cases. Compared to 500 million. But you got to remember, that was over the course of over 2 years. We're only in 6 months into this thing. But if you project, if the numbers stay the way they are, 100 million confirmed cases roughly, 3.2 million deaths worldwide. In the United States, 20 million to 24 million confirmed cases, 700,000 deaths. That is if you project the numbers today over the course of a 2-year period. And I'm doing this roughly off the top of my head. That doesn't mean the numbers will stay that way. Hopefully they'll go down. Hopefully if there is, and more than likely there will be a second wave, it will not be nearly as deadly as the first. But unfortunately, my fears are that it will be. Because the pandemic has become a political football. On one side, you have a side that's actually taking it the way it should be taken, in my opinion. The way it should have been bipartisan. Taking it seriously. Listening to the scientists. Listening to the medical experts and the people who know what the hell they're talking about. And rallying people together to beat this thing. And on the other side, you have the science deniers. You have the people who want this to simply go away. Because if it doesn't go away, their man will not be reelected president. And they will have to deal with the consequences of backing someone who may very well have committed very serious crimes against the country. My fear is the unrest we're seeing right now is only the tip of the iceberg once the election's over with. And one side doesn't get the way it wants to, and that side will probably be the side of the current president. Most people understand that our response has been bad. You can call it incompetent. I would call it that. And given some of the other things going on, the truth of the matter is this president has politicized something that should never have been politicized to begin with. In any other administration in my lifetime, regardless of party, this would have been a bipartisan effort, even in an election year. Even in an election year, it would have been a bipartisan effort to bring the people together. Yes, you would have had some Democrats complaining that we weren't doing enough and Republicans who were saying we were doing too much. But the president, if it had been either Bush or Reagan, would have rallied the people together, both Democrats and Republicans, to beat this thing. The same goes for Clinton and Obama. Now, whether or not Republicans would have joined up with Clinton and Obama, given the fact their history, remains to be seen. Because for some reason after Clinton got elected, the Republicans decided, why are we cooperating since we can't get the electoral results we want? And they sure as hell didn't cooperate with Obama for the most part. In fact, there's solid evidence saying that it was intentional, right from the very beginning, that no matter, even if it was something that was good for the country in a bipartisan effort, they opposed it. Right now, we are in the most toxic political environment since the Vietnam War. We're facing an administration that may very well be more corrupt than Watergate made the Nixon administration look. And all at the same time, we're dealing with a pandemic we've not seen the likes of since a century ago. Why am I so worried? Why am I so fearful? Let me give you a little history. I am a published author. I wrote a book called Through the Hourglass. It's about a security guard that travels forward in time 500 years and is rural. North Carolina County becomes a massive, massive city over the course of 500 years. The reason it became that was there was a great war just a few years after he left that kills 4 billion worldwide, and the aftermath kills 2 billion more, nearly ruining human civilization as we know it. It manages to recover. It manages to survive and later on thrive. I'm in the midst of right now working on the sequel to that book called Past the Hourglass, and also up until recently, in recent years, I was working on the prequel to it called Crucible of Blood. It dealt with a possible second American Civil War, and a Third World War. I started planning that book in 2012. Both books, actually. I was going to write them simultaneously. I'm not a professional author. It's a hobby. I'm not going to say my books are the greatest in the world. It's a hobby. A few people have bought them. Some people have said some nice things about them. But I'm not going to say I'm the greatest author in American history. But in planning Crucible of Blood, I started noticing during the campaign of 2016 some very eerie coincidences. And I stopped work on it because it became too... Life began to imitate the art that I was making. So I put that away. And I won't bring it back until things are better in this country. It may never be better in this country. And that's what I fear. Here's my concern, primarily with what's going on. On one side, you have people on the left who want a fundamental change in the country to address historic grievances of racism, sexism, xenophobia, and frankly, crimes against humanity committed against the native populations. And on the other side, you have a group that doesn't want to address any of this because to them, the only people that matter are Caucasian people, primarily white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They view themselves as the superior race. On the one hand, you have people who believe that America is a Christian nation and who should abandon the Constitution and completely turn over to God and become a theocracy. These people are called the Dominionists. On the other hand, you have people who want to stay the course with the separation of church and state and want to make sure religion doesn't infringe upon the rights of others who don't believe in the same way that other people believe, or who don't believe at all. My book, Crucible of Blood, is about a civil war that's basically a bunch of armed groups fighting each other. It's not a romantic war like the first Civil War was. You don't have highly organized armies fighting against one another. You've got gangs of armed thugs killing innocent people, whether they be black, whether they be gay or lesbian, whether they be Latino, whether they be simply people that they don't like. The truth of the matter is, that it scares me that my book could be coming true. It does. That's why I've not written anything about it for nearly 4 years. I put it away. It's very dark. This is a fundamental change in human civilization we're talking about. 6 billion people of the nearly 8 billion on this planet right now die in this war. 4 because of the war itself, 2 billion more because of the aftermath. But we eventually recover. But the world has fundamentally changed. And I think we're about to go through that. It may not be armed conflict. It may be the fact that this virus gets so out of control that we must be ready for the worst. I don't like thinking about very dark things. I don't like thinking about the worst case scenarios, but experience has shown that planning for the worst case scenario can be helpful in many ways. You've seen movies like Outbreak and The Andromeda Strain and others that dealt with outbreaks of diseases that kill humanity. Some in very sober tones, some that are B-movie classics in such how schlocky they are, how silly they are. This isn't about people turning into zombies. These are people dying. I don't scare easily, but I am a child of the last part of the Cold War, the 1980s. I remember when we used to have nuclear drills. They would be coincidentally the same as tornado drills, but we would be away from the windows. We would be in the safest possible place we could be in the building to avoid a nuclear blast. And I remember those. I remember making the mistake of watching the movie the day after when I was a young kid, and it frightened me so much that I've not watched this again. That's why horror movies do nothing for me. Because with that, plus the Holocaust and everything else, then why would I bother looking at something that, quite frankly, is relatively minor compared to the mass murder that we have inflicted upon one another, or we have planned to inflict upon one another in the past? In situations like this, we see people for who they really are. I tend to look at myself as someone who is sober and sane, who takes the facts as they come and understands the facts may change given how scientific research gives us more information, and sometimes that information can counter previous information. It's the way of life. I fear I'm one of those people that is in the minority. You've got one hand people who think this is the end of the world, who think that letting people die is a good thing, and that we should just simply let nature take its course. And on the other hand, you have people who believe that this is a complete hoax, a conspiracy to somehow deprive people of their freedom. In what way, I don't know. But it's stupid. Unfortunately, there is enough of both these groups of people that I fear for our future. It has exacerbated existing political divides. It has exacerbated racial divides. It has exacerbated ethnic divides and other divisions in our society. That in a normal administration would have been difficult to heal, but in this current administration, in my opinion, that not only doesn't know how to heal these wounds, they actually seek to rip them open even more for their own political benefit. So I don't know if it's incompetence or if it's simply put a plan to simply let the wrong people die and the right people live. To simply let nature take its course. I'm an independent, although I tend to lean more Democrat than anything else. The modern Republican Party is not what it once was back in Reagan's time. They claim to be pro-life, but in many ways I think they're just pro-birth. It's just a political football for them to play. The reality is they promote policies, in my opinion, that perpetuate a rich elite that's primarily white. and they seek to continue to divide people for their own political benefit, as has been the case for decades and centuries now, pitting poor whites against minorities because they want to keep the poor whites ignorant of the fact that the minorities that they're being told are coming to get them are just as in the same boat as the poor whites are. I fear that some very violent times are coming. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that if and when, and I expect when Biden is elected in November of this year, that after some kerfluffle by Trump supporters, they'll realize that he is not the man they thought he was, and they'll simply go back to where they came from, and real Republicans will take control of the party again, and they'll actually be a party of the people and not of a certain elite who are not necessarily, whose best interests are not necessarily those of the rest of the country. History teaches us that in times like this, we should hope for the best, but expect and plan for the worst. Right now, authoritarian regimes are rising across the world. Populism and nationalism are rising again like they did in the run-up to World War II. Russia and China are flexing their political muscles. You have India, which is very nationalistic right now, and trying to show itself as being a world power. And they are having issues with China. And while Russia and China are in somewhat friendly terms right now, the truth of the matter is these are the two big rivals right now. And the United States is, and I hate to say this, we're falling from grace. We're not the number one nation in the world anymore. And I think part of the reason is there are people who have actively worked against that. And I think it's not just one particular party. I think there are people, in some cases, who've been manipulated by outside forces. And I'm not one to automatically jump into conspiracy theories. But I look at what's going on in this country and I wonder sometimes if there is stuff going on that we don't know about. Deals being made to manipulate the country one way and against its own interests. I could go on and on. Maybe this is a condition of the coronavirus, of the quarantine. I'm not paranoid. I try not to be. I try to look at the facts as they are, not as I want them to be, or as I fear they may be. And that's the scary part. The facts that I see are very distressing indeed. Right-wing groups, right-wing militias are arming themselves even more every day, believing that if Donald Trump loses, that they have to right the wrong, according to them. They'll not succeed. But the point may not be to succeed. It may be to cause enough chaos to where the country falls into complete anarchy. To where there may be some generals who decide to, if and when Biden gets elected, to side with the current president because of some stupid reason beyond doing their duty by the Constitution. And that's what I fear. That is what I fear could be happening right now. People meeting secretly, going, what happens if Biden wins? What happens if Trump wins? What do we do? These are things I contemplated in writing Crucible of Blood. But this was a few years back before Trump even thought about running for president again. And you have to remember, he previously talked about running for president, but never did. And many of us thought it was just a joke. He'll fall by the wayside and somebody will come along. But shockingly enough, he won the presidency. And ever since then, we have been paying the price. Our national reputation has been tarnished. You have much more anarchy and violence going on in the country. You have white supremacist groups and neo-Nazis coming out of the woodwork and being public when they basically stayed like cockroaches in the dark of the darkest parts of social media. It's a very scary time. For those of us who look at history and look at what possibly could happen given what has happened in the past, I fear for this nation. I fear for our democracy. I fear for the freedoms that have been fought and died for in this country. I fear we are headed for a very dark time in this country. And this was going to happen before the coronavirus ever came along. Now with this, everything's exacerbated. Now an election that was going to be historic has now become even more so. We hear it every 4 years, the most historic election ever, but the truth of the matter is, this is the biggest election we've faced since 1932. When we could have stayed the course and stayed with the Hoover administration that had exacerbated the Great Depression because of, in retrospect, very bad economic policies. Or, as we voted on, put in Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who did what needed to be done, even though it was not popular, even though it kind of went against a lot of traditional American standards. But it worked. It got us out of the Great Depression. It improved the quality of life from the vast majority of people, although it should have done it for everybody, considering the fact that, yeah, there was still plenty of racism around that time, and some of this great improvement didn't get down to African American people or Hispanic people or other people. And in some cases, it was to their detriment. We'll talk about that at another time. Do I need to even go into the George Floyd stuff, the Black Lives Matter stuff and all of that? That was always there. But because of the pandemic and some blatant examples of police brutality, because of the pandemic, they're magnified even more. Now we talk about defunding police. Well, we don't really need to defund them. We need reform, major reform, to where the police are accountable to the people, and they know this. That if something like this happens, there will be a thorough, impartial investigation, and there will be justice done, one way or the other. And not just to simply take the police officer's word. So, in that case, I have to respond to an email real quick. I hate being doom and gloomish. And I hate the fact that I ate lunch before this podcast, but I was motivated as I was thinking about this to do the podcast. So inevitably I feel like I'm congested when I'm not. I just got through eating a meal. I want you to take away from this the real concern for our civilization. We're tearing each other apart. But the country's name is the United States of America. We've not always lived up to that. We have the opportunity to change that, to make it truly equal for everybody, for equal opportunity for everybody. Doesn't mean everybody will be as successful as other people will be. There will be people who work just as hard and won't make it either. Life ain't always fair. We can try to make it fair. At least make it fair for opportunity for people. Through better education, better health care, better living standards, better economy for everybody, better opportunity. That's what we want. Not just to steal from the rich and give to the poor, but to have the rich pay their fair share and have the poor have the opportunity for a better life to get into the middle class. That's what we want. Why that is such a bad thing is beyond me. We have the word socialism being thrown around, as it seemed to be thrown around every time. Capitalism has gone way too far, and it needs a correction. This isn't even capitalism anymore. It's what I call corporatism. It's not about competition anymore. Capitalism, theoretically, is about competition between private industry, private businesses, to provide the best product for the consumer. That's not happening anymore. Big corporations are stomping on small companies who can do things faster because they can, basically by buying them out and using their power to stifle competition so that they can provide dividends for their shareholders and not simply make things better for all of us. And at another time I'm going to talk about the fact that we're not living in a capitalist system anymore. We're living in a corporatist system. And why this call to socialism isn't actually socialism in the sense of Venezuela or Cuba. It's more along the lines of Scandinavia, which, by the way, has a higher standard of living than we do right now, has a greater sense of happiness amongst the populace, and overall satisfaction. The education systems are better, their economic systems are better, their healthcare systems are better. They're basically better than we are right now. And that's shocking to say. It used to not be that way. But it can be that way again if we humble ourselves to learn from other people and not just to naturally assume that America is great automatically. Let's not forget that, ladies and gentlemen. We could be a great nation again. We're not a great nation right now, but we can be a great nation again. It's not going to be that way under Donald Trump. It may not be that way under Joe Biden. It won't happen overnight. What we must do is to understand that we have to invest in the people. That means the government has to do things. Reagan, 40 years ago, said the government is not the solution, it's the problem. He's wrong. Not entirely wrong, but he's wrong. Government, when it's managed correctly, can be the solution to problems that individuals or private groups can't solve on their own, or don't have the resources to solve on their own, don't have the intuition or the initiative to solve on their own. But mismanaged and poorly run and poorly regulated can become a problem. What we're seeing right now is the exacerbation of problems that have been going on a lot longer than COVID-19's been around. A lot longer. COVID-19 is the magnifying glass that has made us examine these problems. How we deal with these problems is up to us. And how we deal with them in the future will be up to us. We have an election this year. It's in little over 2 months. I know who I'm voting for. It's Joe Biden. I don't think he's necessarily the best person for the job, but he's a hell of a lot better than the person we've got in right now, who I believe his best interest is not America's best interest. I believe he has taken his own personal interest ahead of this country. Why, I don't know. Is it because of being blackmailed by Russia? Who knows? Is it because he's simply a greedy bastard? I don't know. I do believe, though, he is not the right person for the job, and I think in the last 4 years he has disgraced his office. He has disgraced this country. He has made our allies look at us in pity. We have lost our standing in the world in 4 years because of this man. After 8 years where you had Barack Obama rebuild a lot of that after a war that we fought in the Bush administration, the Bush Jr. administration, or as I like to call him, W, ruined a lot of that international reputation because we fought a preemptive war against an enemy that had nothing to do with 9/11, but for some reason we were told they did. And they might possibly have weapons of mass destruction when in reality they didn't. They may have planned on it at one time, but they stopped it after the first Gulf War. They didn't have the resources to do it again. And we were doing a damn good job of keeping them from getting those resources. I'm going to leave you with this. Our system is broken. Simply by voting for Joe Biden doesn't fix it overnight. We're going to have to go through some very painful changes. We may have to amend the Constitution. We may have to scrap the current parliamentary system we have in this country and put to something better that is more representative of the people. Because where we're going right now isn't working. The politicians select their voters through gerrymandering, not the other way around. That wasn't the intention. In the coming weeks, on this podcast and another podcast called Middle of the Road, I'm going to talk about what I believe needs to happen in this country to make it better, to make it to where people will feel like Americans again. That is what I want to see. I want us to all be Americans. We don't have to agree with everybody. We don't have to like everybody in this country. We have to at least admit that we're all Americans. We're not seeing that right now. And in this pandemic, we are the worst prepared we've ever been for something like this. And instead of unifying to fight this thing, we're more divided than ever. We've got people fighting and possibly killing people over mask, over wearing a stupid mask. A minor inconvenience, and people act like it's depriving them of their freedom. A lot's going to change. A lot has to change. It can't be the same way it was. And in the coming days, weeks, and months, I hope to talk about what I believe needs to change. Until that time, I leave you. Hopefully you're doing well. I hope you have a good day today. And as I like to say, good day, good luck, and may the good news be yours.